She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming round the mountain. She'll be coming round the mountain. She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes.
Provocateurs, saboteurs, and propagandists. Propagandists propping old Pappy up, Papa said one day to me as we sat on the front porch, and I was a preteen about that time, but I said, "Well, who's Pappy?" He looked intently at me and he spit his tobacco and said, "The papacy." Now, I did have an idea what the papacy was, but I was confused, so I said, "What's the papacy?" And he just stopped rocking and he said, "Patriarchy." But he was almost like he was spitting it out, like he had a bad taste in his mouth or something. And he's kind of getting a little louder, like I was dumb or something. And I hated to ask what's patriarchy. And he spit his tobacco out and said loudly, "The Pope, the Pope, the Pope." He said it 3 times, like calling a charm. So I returned again with, "What is propaganda again?" And he didn't answer me right away. He looked at me like he was sizing something up. And I guess I passed muster, for then he asked me, had I ever heard of a provocateur? No. Have you ever heard of a saboteur? No. Well, he said, you must know these before you will ever recognize a propagandist. Papa said a provocateur was a man who came into the coalfield appearing to be as poor as a titmouse. He'd appear to be just another downtrodden coal miner from the deep south or from east off the docks in New York. He'd bunk up in the boarding house to glean information. Now his mission was to infiltrate any union meeting and report back to the mine owners and the guards what was the gossip down in the coal mine. His assignment was to identify groups of men who appeared to be union sympathizers. In those days, miners could not outwardly profess affiliation with the union. It was dangerous times for those who whispered solidarity. Miners used to take care of newcomers till they could get up to speed loading coal, so he'd easily found helpers and people who offered to be a friend. But then he spied on every aspect of their life. And after a time, he'd begin using proactive language that would enrage them, speaking to men perhaps who had a particular grievance, who possibly were liquored or easy to anger. He selected his targets similarly like entrapment cases do today. People who are easy to anger are easily led. He used his talking to provoke them to acts of vandalism, to revenge. He is, after all, a provocateur. But Papa went on to say he wasn't the worst. There was a saboteur, who, when the provocateur had made entry into a community, they would send in another, who knew explosives, who knew the tactics of subterfuge. He'd also enter as a new coal miner living and working out of the boarding house, and he'd pal up with the first guy. Only his main purpose was to align with the few men the provocateur had identified in order to empower them to take action. See, he had access to guns and ammunition. Dynamite. He'd use these hot-headed men to create a situation. They're instigated by the corporate spies. These strong union men were always checking newcomers' motives. They were aware of the tactics being used. And after things began happening, contrary to the rank-and-file union plans, they were watching. Because, see, once something violent happened, say pot shots at a tipple or shots at a mine guard, the company would then call in the private police force, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. And eventually they'd ask the state to decree martial law. That way they could then treat the miners any way they wanted. This was actually the goal, and that was actually the purpose of the provocateur and the saboteur, the button pusher and the heavy muscle. They coordinated to bring acts of violence that the coal companies could then blame the miners for. They created the very disturbances in the beginning that the West Virginia mine wars are well known for. My papa said when the company sabotaged their own operations like this, men were shocked that they do it and blamed the Union. These two men would then leave to infiltrate other assignments under new aliases, having done their work of sabotaging Union efforts to organize. But papa said the worst of all of them was the propagandist, for he always appeared to be supportive of the miners' plight. He buried their dead, and he christened their babies. He was the company preacher, preaching out of the company church. He was paid well to preach about turning the other cheek and pay to Caesar what his Caesars do. He talked about being loyal to the coal company who employed you. He talked against the Union, as they were being Bolshevik and Russian, and as being against this country, and told you it was not patriotic to join a Union. He laid claims that even your soul would not ascend to heaven if you broke faith with the church. My grandfather and his father, my papa, said the propagandists didn't count on coal miners ever reading the Bible for themselves. Propagandists count on everyone failing to check the source of your own information. He delights in keeping the status quo. That's his job. His job is to whitewash everything in real time as it's happening, and he does it from a place of authority. And this is what makes him so vile. People trust the propagandist to be truthful, although he never is. He's, after all, propping old Pappy up, and propping up this system of patriarchal corporate power, propping up shoddy interests above human rights and dignity, even above the very Constitution upon which this country was founded. Commentary. I tell these oral truths from Papa so you will see the correspondence in the way systems of control operate. Where did we learn tactics of war and subterfuge? Well, in archaeological excavation and assessments of prehistory, Stone Age, and the Copper Age, there is no large-scale violence. One of the most thoroughly excavated is Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. It was a thriving, egalitarian, porto-agricultural enclave of about 10,000 people. It existed from 7,500 to 5,700 BC on an open plain with a nearby river, and they smelted ore, yet there is no evidence of warfare. If everybody around them was warring, they could not have lived 2,000 years on an open plain. Although there is proof of a massacre of 20 men, women, and children in Africa dated to about 10,000 years ago, it is the only one that has been clearly established as violence of hunter-gatherers. The only one. There's a cemetery 117 in Sudan. It has some arrowheads in bodies indicating the first possible violence, but that was not large scale. So let's understand from archaeology and science what happened. In Mesopotamia and the area of Sumer, the first evidence of organized warfare was about 2400 BC, with skirmishes between cities in the area of the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's not so long ago, about 5,000 years. Ice cores drilled from the polar cap examines the climate in deep history, and they also use tree rings to date drought. Well, they know there was a drought in the area. They've concluded that cities stole grain from one another, and they began to fight over resources. And the priests at that time were the ones who managed grain stores. They managed counts of livestock for each year. This is what the evidence shows, that cities began to build walls. There came a time when they needed to appoint a king, a charismatic leader who could lead men to war. So the priestly tribe came first, and the kings came second. So let's remember now, the priests came first, the kings came second. In those days, people had to plant seed, then they'd go to war, and then they had to come home to harvest. So if a city was sieged, it only had to wait until the army left to harvest. But in 750 BC, the Assyrians were the ones who created the first year-round standing army, and they began to conquer great territories. Now, this was only 3,000 years ago during the Iron Age. 3,000 years ago during the Iron Age. Why are we still fighting? In my humble estimation, it is because once the idea of scarcity and ongoing power struggles of kings seeking to conquer, it became unstoppable. And everything started there. Rome learned tactics from these great empires, and as did Alexander the Great, who was a Greek. It's not a good idea to fault one empire over another. Let's talk about some time in the future where there's no more war. How are we to get there? Yet, if mankind, Homo sapiens, lived about 300,000 years, why in the last 3,000 years are we seeing year-round warfare? It's now a matter of greed. Remember the Cold War mentality? In the Cold War era, having more weapons was to appear strong, and as technology continues to increase creation of new weapons, the profiteers of war and stockholders demand profits. They are driven to use all the weaponry they create. They sell old stuff to third world countries and support various wars across the globe to profit. Still, it is also how they control masses of people. Which brings me to what these provocateurs, saboteurs, and propagandists are doing to those of us evolving compassion in our heart. We're looking at this 3,000 years of war, and we're now questioning the status quo. Today, corporations and governing bodies use these same personas of war and violence to infiltrate and disrupt movements that are grassroots and people-driven. You might think that's not true, but I will tell you why you might want to listen. Papa prepared me for what I'm doing. He said people will enter your life at different times and for different reasons, Jeana. You must always watch a newcomer for a long time. You don't get a second chance at trusting, so folk must show you some loyalty before you should ever trust them. And I listened to my papa. Now, I speak from experience today. I worked as a community organizer across many states through multiple political cycles and many, many issues. And anyone with eyes to see, as if looking over time from a distance, will begin to see that in this country, most issues run a 10-year cycle before the next issue. For example, civil rights and free speech in 1960s, women's rights 1970, ecology, animal rights 1980s, AIDS and LGBT rights 1990s, 2000s, the peace protest and the Truth Commission. The 2010s was about Occupy Wall Street, healthcare, freedom to marry. 2020 was Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and Christian fundamental right to militarism and militias. I've kind of simplified these descriptors, but what I want you to see is that, like cycles and waves of the ocean, these movements come and they go. Why? Because the government has no real need to solve any problem. They use them as moral issues seeking to divide humanity. More devious is the fact that in today's movements, Edward Snowden made it quite clear to all of us the United States is spying on more Americans than it does Russians or Chinese. Why? Because they're using provocateurs and saboteurs to end the very movements we create to point out our societal problems. And I'd go as far to say Antifa ruined peaceful Black Lives Matter. And this explains why and how they did it. And if you don't understand how corporate master uses violence to implement a stalemate, you've likely never heard the things my papa warned me about. Sadly, many of these movements are infiltrated, then cooled and dispersed, or provoked to violence, as the January 6th protest at the Capitol. It ended in criminal charges. This is why new movements spring up from think tanks and colleges with young, inexperienced altruists. And important things, well, they never really get legislation passed. Propping old Pappy up. The church uses its platform to make societal problems into religious, moral issues. Propping old Pappy up. The propagandist is alive and well today. He's favored in the news outlets, and the government uses authoritative talking head entities like retired generals who are paid to comment and create the kind of conversation they want you to hold at church Sunday and in the coffee houses and bars. Well, why is your preacher suddenly involved in politics? Just like the company preacher was used. Well, they're all propping old Pappy up. Everyone in authority thinks we common people have no sense of the underlying themes at work. Their talking is always to justify a war. It's always to protect corporate interests. And it is to devalue common people's labor and to divide mankind's thinking heart. Their playbook is as old as the hills in West Virginia, or, well, really, I could just truthfully say their playbook's only about 3,000 to 4,000 years old in a span of evolution of 300,000 years for us. So how long are we as humankind going to allow this kind of leadership? Well, let's talk about policing. Modern day policing and its brutality got its start in the coal fields of West Virginia and got its start breaking labor strikes at the turn of the century all across the country. And modern day infiltrators set up and jail activists today just as they have always done. They killed dear Spartacus, who led a Roman slave revolt. This is not new. This is what they do. Just look at Atlanta and the RICO charges now against activists who protested the new police training facility that was being built. Now's not the time to publicly protest anything. I've been saying that for a few years now. Not with facial recognition and voila, you're labeled a domestic terrorist, an economic terrorist, or maybe an ecological terrorist, or now a RICO Act criminal gang terrorist. All because we as humanity disagree with public policy and laws. Oh God, help me. Now is the time to read, learn about these things, and about humankind's effort to raise his head above their propaganda. Dare we look toward heaven today? Don't take my word for any of this. Go back and listen to this again. Pause it. Go to Google. Check what I'm saying. Confirm it for yourself. And then listen again. And then pause it. Confirm it for yourself. Check it on Google. We don't need to be led like this anymore. It's offensive to our shared humanity. Dare we live life more abundantly as we've been admonished to do from someone from 2,000 years ago? You know, it's a beautiful world, for we are all in it. And as Mother Jones said, read. Be prepared for the coming times. Is anyone reading, researching, checking sources? I do. And I don't think it's an accident they're banning books. Just think about it. I say with all this enlightenment and new age awakening going on, surely most people have been hoodwinked into some form of submission, for the provocateur, saboteur, and propagandists all sleep well at night, and they're gathering fat paychecks. Yeah, check your acquaintances, know your friends. Create safe spaces to discuss the world as it appears to be and discuss the world which we hope to leave our grandchildren. Teach your children what was taught to me. I've certainly taught my children so they can teach theirs. See, there was nobility, integrity, and ethic in the coal field. They didn't prevail by force. They prevailed by wit and by patience. In 1921 at Marmet, West Virginia, they asked for a congressional review of the awful conditions in the coal towns, and Mother Jones was waiting on that telegram to say they had gotten a congressional review. But some provocateurs convinced others and some of the miners that she was a liar, that she was old, and she had sold out. And yet by 1933, no one could pretend that the feudalistic peasant servant type system was useful to our great nation anymore, and the right to assemble was granted, and the right to a union. Now, you can do more for this country if you only know yourself. Know who you are. Begin to recognize these button pushers, the ones to want to help you to violence, and the holier-than-thou crowd. See, the internet is full of what some people call trolls, but I say they're provoking provocateurs. The saboteur is just seeking you to join their club, their gun club, their alliance. And the propagandists are just using talking points given to them by corporate master. Nothing original there. And one last thing. I want y'all to know, politicians have handlers. They all use talking points handed to them. And I feel great compassion for anyone who has lived and served in public office. It's a thankless job, and yet someone has to do it. Be kind to each other as we learn our sordid labor and world history, and hopefully one day we will all live under grace, whose jurisdiction is thankfully beyond mankind's grasp. And since the priestly tribe created war, perhaps it's time for them to banish war. We truly don't need to continue this madness anymore. When is a 1,000-year reign of peace coming? Can we have that sooner rather than later, Mr. Corporate Master? Please. I want to thank you for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and share. We have a few more stories coming. And stay encouraged as I am. And read for the coming days.
She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. She'll be coming round the mountain.